Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Designing a Successful Return to Work Plan. Thank you so much for joining us. And you can click to the next slide, David. My name is Lisa Beckham, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs that we offer, our contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. There are some logistical items I'd like to discuss before we begin. I ask that you please submit your questions throughout the webinar so we can address them during the Q&A portion of this presentation. To submit your questions during the webinar, please go to the description on the bottom of the YouTube video and click on the link to the question form. Captioning will be available on the video recording 24 hours after this presentation. And you can click to the next slide. We will send an email within a week with a link to the recording of this webinar. The link will be sent to the email address you submitted during registration. And the next slide, please. I'd like to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Designing a Successful Return to Work Plan. As states and cities begin articulating plans to reopen workplaces, it's critical that organizations begin planning and preparing for employees to return safely. In this webinar, we'll look at some key considerations for designing and implementing a successful plan in light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. During this webinar, we'll address and discuss the following: establishing a return to work coordination team, developing a plan that is individualized and flexible, implementing a phase-based approach, including who, when, and where, instituting new workplace practices, rebuilding worker morale, mitigating potential liability risks, including an ongoing monitoring and response team, managing individual requests and promoting employee assistance programs, and lastly, creating a reopening checklist. I'm also very excited to introduce today's webinar presenter, David Hershey. David provides leadership and support for organizational development, reward and recognition, and employee relations activities for emerging growth and middle market organizations in both public and private sectors. David has authored articles on negotiations, leadership and motivation, and consulting. Welcome, David, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'd also like to thank the University of Minnesota, specifically the College of Continuing and Professional Studies, for this opportunity. But I'd also like to thank and congratulate the participants. Personally, you are making a commitment as well as an organizational commitment to making a positive difference. So I thank you in advance for your participation. Look forward to the questions that we have at the conclusion. A brief biographical background, in addition to what Lisa indicated: I've been an independent consultant, Twin Cities based, for about 35 years, previously having worked with large organizations, Xerox's, Pepsi's, Frito-Lay, General Mills. I started my own business, and currently I spend about 60 to 65% of my time consulting with emerging growth middle market companies. I also do a lot of work with public, private, and nonprofit organizations. I spend about 30% of the time teaching at 3 local universities, undergraduate, graduates, as well as adult learners. And the remaining 10% is generally about litigation support, where I'm considered a human resource expert as well as a forensic economist. So with that as a background, and you have on the screen in front of you the 8 items that we're going to be considering for the return to work plan, I'd like to give a few qualifiers beforehand. Most of the items or elements identified, one, are actually a process. They're not an event. I want you to understand that you, in fact, are going to probably be revisiting items. It's not as if it's a checklist that you go sequentially from one item to the next item. And second, they aren't necessarily in priority order, so that you, in fact, are going to have to look and revisit a number of the items periodically. Second qualifier, in addition to the process and the things that we're going to be talking today about the return to work, is that, in my opinion, COVID is a past, a current and ongoing, as well as a pending tragedy. the whole situation is complicated by economic, political, and social issues. But beyond just the numbers, it's becoming somewhat of a desensitized topic that people are not even looking at the numbers. Secondly, there's obviously a significant human as well as economic costs involved with this. And those would be difficult, if not impossible, to quantify. And then third, I believe that we're going to have serious short-term and long-term, short-term for the next 6 to 12 months, and long-term 12 to 18, and for years to come, in dealing with the implications and the problems that we are encountering now as a result of COVID. And then third, in addition to the process with COVID, what we're going to be talking about today are best practices. And as can be expected with the situation that we're confronted with now, best practices are both dynamic and changing. Do as you're doing now, participate, ask, seek, and try to find evidence-based information. So with that as a background and qualifiers, again, Lisa talked a little bit about the elements in designing a successful work plan. Assessment and pre-work is as important or more important than the plan, because the plan is going to be built on a foundation. If you don't have a good assessment of where the organization or body that you're working with is at, you're going to have a hard time coming up with a successful plan. I think that you need to have a commitment from the organization to have a return to work coordinator or a planning team, somebody that's not just happenstance, it's not just an extra human resource activity, but in fact, it's a specifically identified coordinator or team. And although we have individualized, you're going to have flexible return to work plans based on individuals, based on their experience with COVID, based on the organization's experience with COVID, depending on your community, your locale, infection rates, etc. And preparing the workplace for returning employees is not simply sanitizing or hiring individuals to come in on a temporary basis, beginning shifts and ends of shifts, but preparing the workplace for a different type of work. The phased approach, and one of the things that Lisa had mentioned, who, what, and where, you're also going to have people asking why and why not me. So why do I have to go back if in fact I've been working offsite, or why do I have to come back to work if in fact I've been successful? You're going to have to come up with several new workplace policies, and I'm going to emphasize rebuilding the workplace morale and culture. Most organizations, whether it's known or unknown to the leadership, have a culture, and that culture is going to dictate the success you're going to have in the return to work plan. Cannot go without mentioning that you're going to have to mitigate some potential risks, monitor, and have a response plan for those items. And then I've got a dozen reopening checklist items that you should be looking at. On the slide now is some assessments that I mentioned briefly. I want you to think through past, present, and future. Past, what kind of communication forms, and you've heard the term EQ. How many of your organizations have a trust queue, a credible, trusting environment that the employees believe that their managers and leaders have their best interests in mind? What type of communication forms have you had? What has been successful? What has been less successful? What types of mediums do you use? Do you use emails? Do you use text messages? Do you in fact have company meetings? Those types of forms obviously are going to change, and the frequency are going to change. You may have to look at the merits of investing in various communication platforms and identify weaknesses depending on your audience and the audit. A plan's consideration, the past communications and trust is extremely important, but the current level of employee engagement. Some of you may have gone with the surveys, you may have gone with focus groups, you may have looked at a number of things, what your level of workforce engagement is. I would speculate, and most people would agree, that as a result of the last 6 months, COVID has changed most employees' level of engagement, depending on whether they're working or not, depending on what's happening in their household. So that you have to be very careful engaging just because you had a successful Gallup survey 2 years ago, or a successful internal survey, or you had focus groups. How do you know that that's working now? One of the things I think you need to do is look at and ask, how the employees are and what their current concerns are. What are the engagement activities that you've done in the past? What initiatives have worked well? Will they work in the future? And if they haven't worked well in the past, might they work now because of a different environment? What are some of the concerns that your current employee population has? Economic, their job stability, their health, their own health, both home and away. Are they taking care of or tending to sick family members? Or have they had a COVID case in the family, or tragically a COVID death in the family? Those are going to take some of the employees' concerns and engagement to a different level. And one of the things that you should also consider, past benefit offerings and whether you've encouraged employees to take advantage of health and wellness programs. Essence, in large sense, what we're talking about with the present COVID environment is taking advantage of health and wellness programs and the organization's commitment. If you've not had a commitment in encouraging employees to take advantage of their benefit programs in the past, you're going to have a hard time having a successful return to work plan. And last but not least, in assessing the past, is what is the workplace, political, social, and local environments? Are you fighting local trends? Are you in fact trying to be a leader? Serious questions that are going to be asked is, are you really reducing the risk and enabling a safer workplace for your employees, or for the organization, or for both? You need to be prepared. Are you doing this for the community? Are you doing this for your families? Are you doing this for the employees? Are you doing this for leadership? With apologies to Franklin Covey and Stephen Covey, he has a famous text, begin with the end in mind. The successful plan, a litmus test if you would be a way of presenting the communication that has basic information, descriptions, and illustrations that is different than what you've done in the past. Because if you've been successful in the past, you may be successful in the future, but you're going to have to look at new and different ways to communicate. What is going to be the ability of the candidates, and I'm talking about employees, community leaders, to remember and get answers that are meaningful and important to the individuals about the arrangements, about the return to work, and about structures. One of the common expressions that frequently individuals will hear is, when are we going to get back to normal? Or, I want everything to be the way it was. Flexibility and changing conditions, you might as well say farewell to a conventional reopening and hello to the reinvented workplace, or the new normal. And the new normal is evolving. It's not going to be fixed for any period of time. At the bottom line of the return to work is, you need to provide some order, some meaning, and some stability. You need to instill confidence and trust. So if the organization historically has not had and been able to emphasize some stability and inspiring confidence and trust, this might be where you stop the return to work plan, because you're going to have a lot more difficulty than success. The basic question to start out with the planning: what adjustments do we need to make for the well-being of the employee? And I cannot emphasize enough that the employees will see through situations that you are trying to exploit or trying to benefit the organization. We're all going to need to adopt to new ways of working, approaching, and supporting each other physically, emotionally, professionally, and perhaps often personally, depending on the event and extent that COVID has impacted some of your workers. Each organization is going to need to take and make the appropriate level of support and analysis for their specific environment. One of the items that I think you should be prepared to address is reopening workplace and having appropriate data and analytics. To start out with, in order to have a readiness assessment, you're going to have strong leadership commitment, supporting and leading the return to work effort from a human resource function, or from an operations function, or from a president's function, is going to look very, very different. So if you have a strong leader and a strong leadership commitment, the leadership team, it will make a significant difference. You also have to be very candid, and organizations have not sometimes been as transparent financially. What is the commitment that we are going to make short-term and long-term? You've read and seen perhaps many institutions, organizations, universities losing hundreds of millions of dollars in tuition and things that they've had to do to modify the workplace. And then many students are now going online and not wanting to pay tuitions for the online. So financially, what are the short and long-term arrangements and commitments that we're making to the return to work process? What is your organization's people strategy? Many companies have had in the past, people are our most important asset. Unfortunately, I think that's somewhat hollow because I see that very rarely in mission statements. But what is fundamentally the people strategy for the organization and the approach that you've had? If it's hands-off, if we are paying at the 50th percentile, the 70th percentile, the 40th percentile, how do we look at human capital and how do we look at human capital in a changing dynamic environment? When we're talking about human capital, then you also generally will have a compensation and a benefits strategy. If you're paying at the 50th percentile, generally your compensation and benefits are going to be middle of the market, which is very competitive and good. If you're paying at the 70th percentile, you're going to have less to pay for some other operational components. If you're paying in the 40th percentile, you probably have more financial resources to provide certain types. So you're going to have to look at your people strategy and correspondingly connected to the compensation and benefits strategy. Also important when you're looking at the data is what's your sociodemographic profile? The age of your workforce, the ethnicity of the workforce, the education, the home ownership. Different individuals in different markets, different communities, different organizations have different sociodemographic profiles, and their response to the return to work efforts are going to vary depending on a variety of demographic types of issues. You should have a good feel for the populations that have been impacted, and not only your organization, but the community that within you work. You should also seek out some of your healthcare providers, local institutions, universities, hospitals, benefit providers, and what are their return to work recommendations. Industry, many industry organizations have best practices and return to work procedures. Was dealing recently with a paper pulp manufacturing organization, and their industry provided a plethora of types of practices and things to look at for warehousing. What are your local community, and whether or not you want to lead, follow, or not be involved in the community best practices, the employees that live in those communities are going to be somewhat aware of and compare your best practices against those. So I would contend that reopening the workplace requires certain data, certain analytics, and evaluation metrics. And if you choose not to, you will suffer the consequences. Some of you are now wondering why we're spending so much time on the pre-return to work plan and considerations, because if you don't know where you're at, you don't know where you're going to go. You're not going to be successful with the return to work plan. You're going to have to look at some existing policies, practices, procedures. What is your leave of absence policy? What do you do with utilization of sick days? What are your staffing models? What are full-time staffing models, and on what shifts do you staff? You're going to have to look at policies to either be created or revised for that. Looking at your practices also is going to require you to look at new and possibly different detailed position descriptions. What about individuals that have health concerns or modified duty options? I've met and visited with some supervisors and managers that abhor modified duty. They say that's not their problem. It is now their problem. The culture that I referenced earlier, and you've done some assessments on where you're at with the levels of employee engagement, you can consider that a strength, and to be sure it is, but you're going to have to establish a new or a return to work culture. What issues with the past culture are going to support or create issues with the future or the desired culture? With the COVID experience, and again, I'm talking in general terms and not trying to minimize that, but what's been lost or gained? Perhaps you've lost employees, perhaps the employees have lost family members, perhaps employees have lost confidence in their job or their employer, or what's been gained. Individuals, healthcare providers, first line responders, uh, sanitation workers, bus drivers have gained considerable prestige and status because of their experience and willingness to put themselves at risk. So look at what's been lost or gained within your organization, within your company, within your community, and try to accentuate and articulate those things that have been positive or gained as a result. What are some of the key relationships that have been developed, changed, or lost? Training and development. You're going to have new needs. You're going to have some commitments that are going to be accentuated and some that are going to be lost. And losses. What are the implications if in fact you have to hire employees from a part-time to a full-time? What are the onboarding, skills development, and performance management? What is going to happen differently? We need to train and develop the managers to address performance management issues differently than they may have done in the past. I would like you to think about what are the skill sets and the values required for the return to work coordinator and team. And this is before we even pick or establish one. I would use this as a transformational process to optimize a organization's strategy. It's a tough road to hoe, but we in fact have lots of opportunities. Speaking of the return to work coordinator or the return to work planning team, coronavirus and the related developments are changing, obviously at a rapid rate, and the information needs to be addressed promptly and with prudent judgment. So one of the qualifiers for the individual or the team is their access to information and their ability to transfer and relate that information. Those individuals need to be comfortable with, is it the right thing to do ethically or socially? Is it the smart thing to do? Can we make a business case for why we're doing it? Is this a legal thing to do? So that the return to work coordinator or the planning team may have to have some individuals with different skill sets. I would contend that both the individual and the team need to have a predisposition for a continual improvement in health and safety. Again, the employees will see that if health and safety is not extremely important to the organization, then it's not important to them, and you'll have a problem. I would contend that the individual, the coordinator, or the team needs to have a strong appreciation for the mission, vision, and values, and tying some of the things that you're going to be doing with the return to work into the organization's mission, vision, and values. It should go without saying that they should have superior verbal, written, interpersonal skills, and the collaboration ability to work with and track compliance and measure success with a variety of organizations, departments, public and private, both within the organization and possibly outside the organization. Last but not least, the ability to convey the information simply and clearly, and making sure that the things get done and are understood. So you need not an individual lower in the organization with this as an extra thing on their desk. You need somebody that has some sway within the organization. The return to work plan then is going to come down to an individualized and flexible return to work plan. Again, ensuring that you're communicating to the employees that their well-being is a top priority. And I don't think you can communicate that too frequently and too seriously, because if they don't believe, their families don't believe, the community doesn't believe, you're not going to have a successful return to work. Again, going back to the type of communication that you've had in organizations, you need to frequently share accurate, timely, and transparent information. If yours is an organization that has not shared finances, yours is an organization that has not shared or championed various elements of wellness, you're going to have a hard time with the return to work plan. Again, the CDC has come under attack, as well as various organizations, Center for Disease Control, for changing some public health messages. You need to have recommended public health messages and measures to ensure that those messages and measures are understood by the employees. So you may have to have different type of tracking devices and information that you're going to communicate. You're going to have to train the leaders, managers, and colleagues how to be more empathetic and how to support employees. Because if I was not a very good supervisor in the past, or all I cared about was production, I'm not really excited to go back to work for that type of an individual. A major stumbling point for a lot of individual and organizations is the employees are going to want flexible options for returning to work or continue to work from home. Many large organizations have now indicated set dates, December 1st, January 1st, next June, everybody will be back on whatever the working campus was. They're going to lose significant talent and resources by forcing employees back to an environment that employees don't feel comfortable with. You're going to have to come up with clarifying positions and the new minimums, realigning the work. What work can be done blended? What can be done flexible? We should look at the learning that we've had in the past several months and what people should be prioritized for returning, and how do you incentivize certain populations to stay? The question, why me or why not me, is what you're going to have to address. The physical environment is obvious depending on the organization and minimizing the possibility of COVID contamination. I would suggest that the way you do this is not one date certain, but looking at and implementing a phased approach. You look at the data, you look at the engagement levels, you look at the perceptions of the employees, the health and energy indications, the economic information, and figure out what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. If you've had people that have been laid off or are going to be potentially laid off, you look at perhaps temporary services, alternatives, maybe outplacement, or returning to full-time some employees that have recently been severed. Establish some evaluation metrics, and I would strongly suggest that the return to work coordinator or team is responsible for tracking the metrics. We've seen story after story of local universities, national universities, University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana anticipated that they would reopen 2 weeks ago. They expected to have 200 students with COVID during the course of the semester. In the first week, they had 700. Then what's going to happen and what's going to change as a result of having 700 versus 200? You need to have the responsible tracking and the information. I would also suggest you need to design a collaborative approach once the initial direction is set. You're going to have to be flexible. Again, by function, by department, by site, by team. One size return is not a phased approach. One size does not fit all situations. You're going to have to establish some communications, technology, human resources, and functional checklists to ensure that people, in fact, understand. We have 4 slides for those of you following along with the slides on workplace practices and rebuilding the morale. First 2 slides are going to talk about workplace practices. Human resources is probably more valued than ever before at this point in time with the unsettled and situations in flux. HR is going to have to be able to rapidly change plans and communications. You're going to have to re-examine some of the remote and flexible blending operations, delegate and determine what are core activities and what's going to be replaced and what's going to be abandoned. You've got investment in some nice to have programs. They are going to be dropped. You're going to have to favor flexible programs to respond to a wider variety of employee needs. Some departments and business units fit better for a transformational strategy, some don't. The size and shape of the organization, what are the HR implications? What are the salary, the payroll, the financial? When we're looking at strategic workforce analysis and revalidating the decisions around critical jobs, work location, and productivity. Executive compensation in many organizations may need to be redesigned. Organizations are going to want to take advantage of some pension plans, contributions, funding. All of this leads to communicating, and using what I would consider common sense, metrics, and empathy is going to establish the new normal. Speaking of the new normal, I've indicated that the workforce and employee engagement is important. We need to reconfirm the organization's mission, vision, and values. If you've not communicated and articulated that, why are people there and why should they stay? You're going to have to define some new leadership behaviors and a way of changing for some of the executives to sustain some of the changes in the culture. We're going to have to train staff and change compensation and structures to reflect the shifts in values. Performance management is a fundamentally important component in most organizations, as is the succession plans. What are some of the recent learnings around leadership in a crisis behavior that have in fact evidenced some leadership capabilities and skills that we've not seen before, or people that have stepped up? We're going to have to invest directly and grow to improve employees' resilience and capabilities, because they're going to have some flexibility and do things different. The quickened digital transformation and redesign of some of the policies and practices, good luck. You're going to try to endeavor to make them future-proof and crisis-proof. You're going to have to address a lot of things and be more flexible than ever before. The compensation and benefits are going to be adjusted to support the workers that are going to be required on site, new roles and transformation. You may have to change short-term and long-term incentive plans to pivot with the new transformational agenda. How is sustainability, a sense of purpose, and the corporate values embedded in the performance plans and in the goals and in the compensation? You're going to have to figure out ways to support the workforce mentally, physically, financially. You're going to have leaders that are going to respond to new expectations. Leaders are going to have new expectations of employees, but employees are also going to have new expectations of the leaders. The mitigating potential risks and ongoing monitoring goes back to somewhat of the metrics and the community, but what criteria are you going to use to evaluate safety guidelines? Again, emphasis on well-being and execution are fundamental. How are you going to evaluate the ongoing health? And I would suggest that you stress test those plans. There are some HIPAA and OSHA requirements that you need to be aware of. How are employees going to receive alerts from different authorities implementing different strategies or stages? Employees coming in, will they be turned away at the door? Employees that are infected or thought to be infected or call in sick? How are we going to handle and monitor and respond to those? How and when will monitoring and intervention be communicated to various stakeholders? I want you to think of customers. I want you to think of employees' families. I want you to think more broadly than shareholders, but stakeholders. How are you going to have a method to listen to staff concerns, put them into plans, and monitoring whether or not the employees believe that what you've put into place is going to work? So we've identified a dozen checklist items, and it's going to sound as if, again, that they are a list of items that you can rotely check off. I'm indicating that they are a process that you need to be cognitive of and aware. How are you going to stay on top of local, state, and national guidelines? Even if the government guidelines allow for employees to return to work, is that best for the business, for the customers, for the employees? What are the requirements in each physical location? And each geographic site and facility, even within a city, may be different. There are going to be important workers' comps and unemployment considerations for many of the decisions that you make based on masking, restricting capacity, cleaning, social distancing. Most of the organizations that I've dealt with, 468 in the last 20 years, have shared workspaces. What are you going to implement and incorporate protocols and processes? How's the company going to make decisions about capacity, cleaning supplies, manufacturing assembly lines, contact centers, retail settings? How would the organization manage visitors, employees travel? How is the rapidly changing environment going to be handled? Are the policies that you come up with in line with organizational intentions, government regulations, or both, or neither? What personal technologies are employees engaged in that maybe you should utilize? Be they Snapchat, be they Zoom, be they various types that you in fact could capitalize. I think you should look at focusing on cost containment and zero-based design efforts. That's going to take a lot of effort then to look at the things that we're going to have to cut to make up for the implementation of some of the COVID mitigation. And a key important component is solicitation of feedback on the plan that you have. How is it being delivered? And is it delivering the desired outcome? How's the plan going to be updated? And what's going to be communicated within the organization? How's it being supported? How is service provisions being affected? In addition to the return to work coordinator or the team, who's going to be responsible for reassessing employees, families, adhering to the CDC's advice? Are we going to provide any PPEs, the personal protective equipment? Most fundamentally in all of what I've shared so far is establishing and ensuring that you have appropriate two-way feedback channels for employees' questions, concerns are able to be communicated, containment measures, and then what are you going to do for rules around regulating movement, restrictions for shared spaces like kitchens, bathrooms, elevators in your places of employment. So you have the communication tools, you are communicating out, how are they communicating back to you? Within most organizations, you belong to some industry groups, you belong to certain communities, chambers of Congress. There's going to be several models or plans on transitioning, but circumstances will change, not only may. There are going to be ways of community infection. What's going to happen? How do you best prepare? Want you to consider looking at industry groups, insurance, benefit brokers, healthcare providers, as well as national, state, and local agencies with excellent resources. You can do Google searches and go online to look at what some organizations have succeeded and failed. Four that I found that I think are pretty positive. Accenture has put out 5 priorities in helping you to return and reinvent your business. IBM has got an extensive return to work advisor supporting the health concerns and readiness. Microsoft has come up with a return to the workplace with confidence. And again, I mentioned the WHO, World Health Organization, has a several 100-page document that you can scan and look at. So there are a lot of different things that you can do. One of the things that I would caution you on, though, is the utilization of humor. We have humor in a variety of venues. Some of us use humor appropriately. Some of us have a dry sense of humor. Some use humor inappropriately. So when we're dealing with something as serious as the COVID, when we're dealing with something as serious as a return to work plan that is a process, not an event, when we're dealing with something that's as serious that has economic, social, political implications, I think humor can help, but caution. I have a screenshot there of Wilson, an Australian herding dog, is working from home now, and he's looking through the screen at the sheep. Some people would think that's funny. Some people would think that that's boring, but I want to caution the utilization of humor needs to be tempered in a situation such as what we're dealing with. At this point in time, I'd like to turn it back to Lisa and ask if there's anything that we can respond to that the participants have seen that either triggers questions, comments, or concerns. Lisa.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. We have 2 questions that we can address. So the first one is from an individual, and they write, as an individual that is required to physically return to the organization I work for, what everyday tactics would you recommend for a safe return? So should they be socially distancing at work, wearing masks, any other advice you would have for them to safely return?
Thank you. There's 2 parts to that question. What should they do? But it's also partially responsible for what the organization will do or should do. The organization should make them feel welcomed and afford them the opportunity to do what they feel comfortable with within the parameters of what the organization. If the organization has been silent or not affording them, then the employee is going to have to vote with their feet, the metaphor, and they're going to have to do what they think. I have the opportunity. I have teaching currently at 3 different universities. They are very aggressive, but I carry lots of hand sanitizers with me, different types of masks. I wear gloves when I'm going in and out of buildings because of the doors. So the individual is going to have to look at what they feel comfortable with. And I have a vulnerable individual at home. My wife has some heart conditions, lung conditions. So I am hyper vigilant. Some people would say, gee, if the students and you have social distancing, you don't need to be that hyper vigilant. It's what makes me feel comfortable. So the question is, what is the organization doing? And then also, what's the individual feel comfortable with? So I would do whatever you need to feel comfortable. And unfortunately, the individual may have high level of need for security, and there may be some shaming going on at work. And that's on the organization, that they have not prepared or provided an environment that people feel comfortable expressing their concerns. Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I really enjoyed that you mentioned voting with your feet and just really making sure that the organization can listen and take in that type of feedback, especially if they do have to take extra precautions for loved ones at home. Our second question comes from someone, and they say, at the organization I work for, I'm further down the totem pole. So what steps can I take and what can I do to ensure the organization I'm working for is following your advice or guidance from this presentation to ensure my colleagues, my community, and myself can return safely?
Excellent question. Then again, we would like to think that leadership emanates from the top, but leaders are throughout an organization. So by participating in this, that individual is illustrating leadership. Either take a copy of this. I can send them a copy of the slides if they would like. They can take a screenshot of a couple and then go to their manager and say, this is something that I came across recently. What are we doing? And if the manager or the individual in their organization says, don't worry about it, I would go to that manager's manager. Or if in fact the manager says, we've got it covered, then you would indicate we don't have enough communication. So it has to come from the top, but it also has to bubble up from below, so that the individual has to be able to articulate and express the concern. And that goes back to some of the opening comments and slides, that the past, present, and future, if the organization has not been committed to communicating to the employees or been transparent, or that they have a high trust quotient, this is not a place or a time that the organization is going to be able to capitalize on those shortcomings. So again, congratulations, glad to have you here. I would work with your manager, and if he or she is not willing to work with you, I would work with their manager. And if they're not willing to work with you, I would consider other options of employment. Easy for me to say.
Yeah. And then one of our final questions is from someone that has mentioned that they enjoy more of a copycat approach. So you mentioned earlier a few organizations that are doing a couple of steps well, but they're asking what organizations do you know have so far taken the appropriate steps to ensure a safe return to work?
Let me give a metaphor, and that's, again, a very good question. With technology, there's usually 4 stages. Companies can be on the bleeding edge, way out there, very expensive, very risky. They can be on the leading edge. They can, in fact, let some of the early pioneers and the folks look at, and that's expensive but competitive. You can be competitive with technology, and most organizations that think they're competitive actually lag. And then you can be a lag. So you can be out in front, bleeding edge, leading edge, competitive, or lag. Part of it comes down to where the organization wants to be relative to the return to work. I think you need to be on either the bleeding edge or the leading edge. And the 4 organizations that I identified, and the information at the end will give you some leading and bleeding edge types of situations. But again, to the previous question, if you're within an organization that wants to be, quote, competitive or lag, that's a bad place to be. Because even if you think you're following the community, you are probably lagging because the information has been out there for a while. So again, good question, provide the information, And I would propose the 4 sites that I gave you at the end will provide some information on leading or bleeding edge. Again, a very good question.
Great, and we had one more come in through the chat, and it says, it's asking if you're aware of how the University of Minnesota is preparing to help departments navigate or reorganize or reassign job duties based on COVID, and how they stay within the federal laws.
All right. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit from some knowledge. I have a great deal of respect. I've not met personally the new president, but I think she's doing a fantastic job of leading the university. I'm looking at it from not so much of an employee. I've been an instructor and a teacher there. So the things that they've done from the students of slowing things down and changing, but from the employees in maintenance and so forth, I'm not that cognitive or familiar with. But again, I believe the university has good leadership, so the decisions and the processes they're going through, I have some confidence in, but I don't have any specific knowledge of budgets or what organizations are being pared back or cut back. But again, it goes back to, I have some trust in the leadership, being an alumni of the University of Minnesota, having worked through the Carlson School and through the college for 30 some years. I believe that they're doing what they can do and should do.
Yeah, and I think that would be all of the questions that we've had so far. So just want to thank you so much again, David, for taking the time of the day to share your incredible information for us. It was a pleasure having you here and to speak on this pretty difficult topic, but very important to understand. If you'd be able to, David, put the last slide up so that I can go over a couple of things. So as I mentioned earlier, we will be sending everyone a link to this webinar recording within a week. So you'll receive a link to this webinar recording as well as the slide deck. If you enjoyed this webinar and you would like to continue engaging in some similar topics, you can register for our upcoming webinar, Building Resilient Teams. And that's part of our current webinar series, and that's strategies to promote workplace well-being. My contact information will be also available on this last slide. So if you have any questions or like to learn more information, you can always contact me from that slide as well. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Take care, and I hope you all stay safe.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, participants.